All right, welcome back to another episode of This Week in AI Security, coming to you from Finland for the week of the 18th of June, 2026. And while a lot of Northern Europe may be ready to take the summer off, the AI industry is not. We've got a ton to jump into this week, so let's get started. I'm just going to go quickly through a couple of things around topics that we have talked about any number of times on the show, and that is supply chain, infrastructure around AI, et cetera, with a couple of stories to get started with. First is 144 packages within the master namespace compromised by a single hijack contributor account. Some malicious code was hidden in a third-party library called Key Payday, pushed through an automated publishing campaign, only lasted 88 minutes, but it did get downloaded and consumed by some people who are users of those packages. Really highlights the speed and scale of supply chain attacks right now. Really also highlights the need to not necessarily just be grabbing the latest version of any package that you use in your own infrastructure or your own stack right now. So do bear that in mind as you think about building out your own agents and applications, etc. Moving on to the next one, we've got a vulnerability, a critical severity one in the Brins Tech AI infrastructure platform, specifically something called the Praise-On AI orchestration platform. The key issues here are some authentication evasion, some broken access controls, and automated agent manipulation. This has already been detected in the wild and has been used in exploits in the wild. Again, look at some of the architecture that you're using, look at some of the components that you're building in, maybe gravitate towards more established packages. While I know that is very difficult when you're trying to build on some of the latest technology and really be at the cutting edge, as we all are right now in AI, but do bear that in mind. Do think a little bit about the packages that you're consuming, etc. We've got another one on the JetBrains side. This is the JetBrains marketplace. At least 15 malicious plugins. These are plugins that do everything from coding assistant to other pieces of functionality. They silently exfiltrated AI provider API keys. And again, we've talked about how all AI consumption happens over APIs. So APIs become not only the attack surface of choice, but they are also the number one credential when it comes to things like API keys. That is how attackers are going to use your AWS or similar environment to, let's say, manipulate models or to run up a big bill by using your keys to run models that they're going to consume. The malicious plugins in the JetBrains case had been downloaded about 25,000 times before being flagged. There's additional risk of some Chrome extensions that are also around this ecosystem. So moving on, we've got a really interesting unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability in the Hugging Form Transformers environment. So we have been talking about using things like third-party tools and packages for a long time as an industry as a way to get ahead. Why would you reinvent the wheel? Why would you go build something that already exists? And, we've talked about a couple of the stories already in today's episode, but we're going to come into this one here as well. So this is a CVE with the ID of 2026-4372, and it proves that a single polluted line in an innocuous looking config file can potentially give an attacker full RCE on your inference servers, even if you explicitly told the library not to run remote code. So these AI frameworks are being built for speed and developer convenience, not enterprise security. We've talked about that trade-off and the tension between speed and security right now. It is an internal field or it appears to be an internal field with ATTN implementation internal, but that could silently short circuit a security control that really highlights how AI libraries handle external data. And if you think about the blast radius of this, you've got, potentially hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of workflows, automated CI/CD pipelines, et cetera, that are pulling down models or communicating with models constantly. And if attacker poisons a community-based model that you might be using, they aren't just getting data, they're getting access to your environment and potentially your credentials and API keys if they implant a malicious flag inside some of that then exfiltrates data from your environment. It's one of the things that really kind of speaks to a need to have constant inventory so that when a compromised environment like this or a compromised package or a compromised model is identified, you know immediately what the impact to your organization might be around that. All right, moving on. We've got a really interesting story from the folks over at TalkSec around something that they're calling Agentjacking. And they are referring to it as basically this kind of way to manipulate automated systems into executing malicious code. So let's break it down real quick. The attack specifically weaponizes Sentry, which is a very popular application monitoring tool. It is something that you implement inside your code, and it helps you and your software development team understand how your users are using your application. Also helps you identify errors inside the environment. So when a user, let's say, tries to navigate from page 1 to page 2 and encounters an error, something in the Sentry monitoring might help you identify what the error is. Was it a parameter that didn't get passed correctly from page 1 to page 2, etc.? And very often, Sentry API keys are intentionally public. They're embedded in front-end JavaScript so that they can be out there collecting all of that user activity. The attackers can pick up these keys. They can use those keys to inject malicious Markdown instructions into your error logs. So what happens normally is that as a user is using your application, they hit an error. The Sentry API key is used to then send an API request using that key to your Sentry backend saying, oh, the user hit an error going page 1 to page 2, missing parameter, whatever the case may be. Well, knowing that API key, it's not hard to figure out how to send your own Sentry formatted messages in a way that the Sentry system will then kind of interpret and potentially act upon. And of course, one of the most tempting and high value use cases is not to have a human process all of those Sentry error messages, but have an AI agent process those Sentry error messages. A developer might say, hey, find and fix my Sentry errors, and then use that to update their code base with bug fixes, etc. And the thing is, this will bypass WAFs, this will bypass EDR tools, because this is a normal, well-formatted Sentry error log, etc. So it's a really interesting kind of, and I like the word agent-jacking, but a hijacking of a very legitimate agent for a purpose that is very, very common and high value for an organization, and an area where, again, many organizations are going to be looked to deploy agents to improve code quality, improve efficiency, improve developer productivity, what have you. All right, moving on to our next story. This is a one-click CVE in a Microsoft platform that specifically combines an AI-specific parameter-to-prompt injection via Copilot's search parameters with an HTML rich condition using Bing's image search endpoint. And I know that's a lot, and it's a very complex chain. Very big kudos to the team over at Varonis who identified this. They communicated it to Microsoft. Microsoft agreed, validated, tracked it as a high-severity CVE. It is already patched on the Microsoft platform, so you don't need to worry about that aspect of it. But it does highlight how, there are all these kind of edge cases around particular conditions that may not have been tested in your own QA process, because you can't anticipate every single string that a user might send to an agent, right? This is one of the things about these agents, is they are free-form human looking text, natural language. And so it's very, very difficult to identify what's going to happen with something like a parameter to prompt injection, etc. All right, moving on, we've got a couple of stories around something called the Shai-Hulud miasma. And of course, Shai-Hulud, you've probably heard that name, a worm that was or has been out now for well over a year, I want to say, but it's now making its way into more AI use cases. Got a 4.6 megabyte JavaScript payload that is being dubbed Shai-Hulud miasma. That has been discovered. It's been validated by several organizations, research teams, etc. It exploits static code analysis on leaked source code to find and hijack AI tools, specifically targeting the exposure of credentials and API keys. One of the other interesting things around this is very similar to that last story about Sentry. We've seen now instances of attackers realizing that one of the ways to avoid detections of malware planted via some of these supply chains is to include instructions about topics that are off limits, such as, let's say, bomb making, nuclear weapons, bioweapons, etc. And that'll prevent the LLM from continuing to analyze the threat, because they'll stop analyzing some of the log files and messages that might be coming out of these worms. And there are additional now kind of knock-on effects where these malware and worms can get into packages that are including in software development in projects and so on. And they can do things like leverage an SDK's logic around things like predictable naming conventions for storage buckets and so on. So we've got a CVE identified for something here from the Unit 42 team over at Palo Alto. They're calling it pickle in the middle exploit. This is a kind of a mini Shai-Hulud thing. wrapped into a Python set of packages that are used in an SDK for building on the Vertex AI platform. And so effectively, the attacker identifies that you may be using this. They'll know that your SDK is going to probably predict a bucket name of a very specific format. And so the attacker goes and creates a bucket with that format and maybe leaves it open to you. And so what ends up happening is that you, as a user of one of these compromised SDK environments, you say, hey, I need to store some images or something like that. The SDK checks to see, does this bucket exist? It already does, because it's been created by that attacker who leaves it open for write permissions. And your data can be exfiltrated because you're pushing data out to a bucket that you assume exists in your infrastructure, but might exist in somebody else's infrastructure. It's also sometimes called the bucket squatting vulnerability around that. So think about this again. Again, I would probably point to a mitigation strategy of not necessarily grabbing the latest, but maybe pegging to a known good version. All right, moving on. We've talked about kind of the Claude Mythos effect and the vulnpocalypse fears of an upcoming, huge surge in number of CVEs reported. That is confirmed to be true. We're tracking towards 66,000 CVEs. To put that in context, that is well higher than any year prior to now. It is also directing or kind of, let's say, urging the Center for Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to release a new directive, BOD 2604, completely throwing out patching timelines and moving towards a super fast 3-day deadline for the most dangerous total control software flaws. And if you've paid attention to CISA guidelines over the past, you will know that it's really, really rare to see anything as rapid as 30 days historically. That's for the very, very most critical CVEs in the past. So moving towards a 3-day deadline is really kind of a major, order of magnitude increase on that side. All right, something else from the folks over at TalkSec. This is something that they're calling the lethal trifecta, when AI agent simultaneously has 3 dangerous capabilities: access to sensitive private data, exposure to untrusted external content like emails or web pages, and the ability to execute outbound actions or communications. When these 3 things are all coincide, attackers can weaponize indirect prompt injection. So that will be things like hiding malicious text instructions inside business data like web pages, documentation pages, etc. We've talked about this a couple of times. This is just kind of a nice, concise way of framing the 3 things together. All right, moving on to our last story for this week. And I like to close on a little bit of a think piece. So let's talk about what's happened with Anthropic over the last couple of weeks. So on the 9th of June, they released their next generation ultra capable tier. This is the Fable family launch for a general commercial availability with some safety guardrails built in. And the Mythos 5 family, which had been highly restricted in safety classifiers under something called Project Glasswing rather, had been launched to an approved group of cyber defenders due to its privileges. And Anthropic faced some blowback for enforcing a 30-day data retention policy on Fable users, which was intended to monitor for jailbreaks, but did raise some privacy concerns. There was a vulnerability flagged by some researchers at Amazon who found a narrow jailbreak vulnerability in Fable 5. The flaw was flagged directly to senior U.S. national security officials, and that led on June 12th, only 5 days later, to the U.S. Department of Commerce bypassing administrative delays and issuing a sweeping immediate export control directive, which meant that no foreign nationals, so only U.S. citizens, could access this. And that led to a global deactivation of the model. So a really, really fast time frame here. That really sent a lot of shocks around any number of issues, whether that is access to model cyber capabilities, sovereignty, which is a big topic right now in the European Union, but executing this kind of kill switch is really the first type of action that we've seen at this level. So something to keep an eye on. I'm sure this story is not done. All right, a lot of stories, a lot we got through this week. I'm sure that was a lot to digest. We'll talk to you next week.